Let's return to the war in Yemen. The country has been gripped by war for more than 8 years, with the United Nations calling it the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. Well, Sky News has been granted special access into the country after the two countries fuelling the conflict, Iran and Saudi Arabia, agreed to renew diplomatic ties. So let's get a view on what's going on. So Mark Lowcock served as the UN's Emergency Relief Coordinator, and he joins me now. Very good morning to you. Thanks so much for coming in. So as we were saying, our special correspondent, Alex Crawford, is in Yemen. Extraordinary access to a country that many of us have not seen anything of because it's so hard to get in and report from there. We talk about peace potentially beyond the horizon. We'll talk about the prospects for that in a moment, but it's certainly not something that she saw when she went in. How would you reflect on the situation there now?
Well, firstly, kudos to Alex Crawford. I know Alex has reported a lot from Yemen over the years, but she's the first top journalist from a global broadcaster to be in there for a while. And the story that she tells in that piece you've shown today from Taz is typical of what's happening all over Yemen. People's lives have been totally trashed by this war. It is one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. It's not got better, even though the violence has come down a bit. And the main reason for that is that there's been no chance to recover or rebuild. 80% of the population are reliant on aid agencies, the UN, the Red Cross, NGOs, for food. And the amount of money that's been raised for that, as the eyes of the world have come off this problem, has been falling. 2 or 3 years ago, when I was at the UN responsible for this, we were raising $3-4 billion a year. Last month, at this year's fundraising event, they only raised $1 billion. So that needs to change if we're not to see, despite the prospect of peace, massive additional loss of life.
So what do you do about that? How do you raise the profile of this conflict when so many people are suffering?
Well, it is difficult because the eyes of the world are on Ukraine, Afghanistan, other places. But I think that the fact that Alex and hopefully other people are there and reporting will shine a spotlight on this. I think the world still is not willing to tolerate mass loss of life running into the millions, which is avoidable. And a bit more money in Yemen this year, while negotiations go on, could help keep the situation calmer and save a lot of lives.
Well, yes, and give us a sense of the scale of aid that's needed, the gap. I think the Norwegian Refugee Council says that only a quarter of the billions that are needed for humanitarian aid are actually being promised, less than 5% provided for this year. So there's a huge gap there, isn't there? And are people making commitments and then just not delivering?
So there is a huge gap, and it used to be better 2 or 3 years ago. The UN 2 or 3 years ago was feeding 10 million people a month because it was raising enough money to do that, keeping all those people alive. Now those numbers have come right down because the money's fallen away. The biggest missing money, if you like, is from the Gulf countries. About 3 years ago, Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis came to the UN and gave us, the Secretary-General of the UN and me, a cheque for $950 million. And that enabled us to ramp up these relief programmes. Now, I think partly because they're frustrated with the behaviour of the Yemeni parties, the Gulf countries have stopped financing. They haven't provided or announced any money for the UN this year, and that needs to be addressed diplomatically. There are other countries, I'm afraid the UK is one of them, which has reduced its funding as well. So everyone needs to put their shoulder to the wheel to keep all these people alive until peace can be consolidated, and then they can have some recovery and rebuild their lives.
So what's your message to the UK government then?
Andrew Mitchell, actually, to his credit, when he was on the backbenches, did a lot to draw attention to the need to find political dialogue, a peace process in Yemen. He travelled there. He was a big advocate for more humanitarian aid. I hope now he's back in government, he's banging the same drum inside the system.
And we talk about the prospects for peace. The two countries fueling this war, Saudi Arabia and Iran, relations have thawed a bit between the two countries, something of a surprise agreement on thawing diplomatic ties or re-establishing diplomatic ties. How hopeful are you that that could prove to be fruitful in some way?
I think this is the most interesting development over the last several years, actually, facilitated by the Chinese foreign minister, and it could generate a couple of positive things. Firstly, just last month, the Royal Navy intercepted a boat coming from Iran to provide Russian armaments, actually, to the Houthis. The Saudis have been arming the other side of the war. If they stop doing that, that will calm things down and will enable a truce to be consolidated. The second thing they could do, though, is use their political weight and power, both the Iranians and the Saudis, to say to their Yemeni proxies, we've had enough of this. You need to behave in a different way. You need to get around the negotiating table and give the 30 million people of your country, like those children who we saw in Alex's report, who are simply being starved to death by this war, give them a chance of a better future. And our eyes are on you, and that's what we want you to do. And the wider world is going to be expecting you to do that as well. That kind of diplomatic pressure does create an opportunity.
And there's a grim anniversary, I think, this weekend. I think it's 8 years since the war began in earnest. How much longer do you think this will go on?
Wars are easy to start and hard to stop. And this one in particular, which is fundamentally in its origins a civil war with multiple groups and tribes and different political outfits and everybody willing to put tens, hundreds of thousands of young boys often and men to the front line in pursuit of their their goals, has had a lot of staying power. Wars end when the parties have had enough of the fighting and enough of the bloodletting, and when enough pressure is brought to bear on them. So it's possible we could see progress, and everybody should really take this opportunity and put their shoulder to the wheel to secure that.
OK, so Mark Lowcock, we really appreciate you coming in to talk to us about the so-called forgotten war that we won't be forgetting, certainly today here on Sky News. Thanks very much indeed.